In this video, I want to share with you 5 things that not only improved my watercolor paintings a lot, but took them to a whole other level. Let's start with number 1. Less is more. This lesson took me forever to learn, but it's probably one of the most important ones. And it's this: the fewer layers you use to finish your artwork, the better it will look. It sounds counterintuitive, but it's true. You can only add about 3 to 4 layers before the painting and all your colors start turning into a muddy mess. In one of my previous videos, I described my painting process as stacking glass shards on top of each other. The more different colored shards you stack on top of each other, the more gray or dull your colors become. And on top of that, you can only clearly distinguish maybe 3 different shards. But when you add some more, everything fuses together to a big bland mess. And in a watercolor painting, that's one of the worst things that can happen. Here are some of my student works who kindly allowed me to criticize them. So these are examples of muddy areas so that you know what I'm talking about. Here we have areas with muddy parts where my students try to blend and mix the paint together, which is impossible with watercolors. So I recommend painting only a few layers. And here we have an example of student artworks where they succeeded in layering and leaving edges be, and less trying to blend everything together. That being said, all of my students did great work here. And to be honest, this is a technique that you have to wrap your head around and just practice it over and over again, especially if you haven't painted like that before. And there's no better way to do that than by joining me on Patreon and watching over 200 step-by-step lessons and painting videos. You can download my references, material lists, and sketches. Print them out and follow along at your own pace. Just follow the link in the video description and get started now. 2. Getting the right paper. This is also a super important thing you need to know about watercolor painting. There are 2 main kinds of watercolor paper: hot-pressed and cold-pressed watercolor paper. These 2 types behave entirely differently, and watercolor techniques can look vastly different on each of them. Cold-pressed paper, for example, is always rougher and has a stronger texture than hot-pressed paper. It absorbs way more water than hot-pressed paper, creates very even blendings, and you can paint super smooth on it. However, it isn't particularly suitable for mixed media techniques, as its surface is too rough to add color pencils or gouache. It's not impossible, but it doesn't work as well. It also doesn't create many of the abstract effects I'm interested in, like edges or color bleedings. Because the water gets distributed more evenly, it creates an overall soft look. There are ways to create really beautiful abstractions with the cold-pressed watercolor paper, but since I find the hot-pressed paper more versatile, I specialized on this kind of paper and created techniques around that. Hot-pressed watercolor paper, especially with a satin finish, is the best watercolor paper I can recommend if you follow my techniques. You can work on it with color pencils, gouache, oils, acrylics, whatever you want really. The surface is so smooth that it doesn't create unwanted textures or grain. That being said, there are unfortunately huge differences between hot-pressed watercolor paper brands. Some of them don't allow layering, and watercolor layers get smudged and blend together whenever you want to add a new layer. So you want to get a brand that is perfect for layering. I currently work with Hahnemühle Collection hot-pressed paper, which I can recommend, and I linked it in the video description for you. Here's a difference between 2 of my artworks. The left is done on cold-pressed paper and the right artwork on hot-pressed paper. As you can see, the abstract areas are just not as nice as on the hot-pressed paper. Number 3. Don't seek perfection. Never try to render every single detail of your reference photo. This will not look good. You don't need to paint every single hair or pore of the skin or every lash or every single shadow in the face. It will not make your painting better, believe me. This is a hard lesson and it took me a decade to understand it. Trying to get everything quote-unquote right will only destroy all the beautiful effects your first watercolor layers did for you. Instead, focus on the important things. Is the contrast right, for example? Most beginner watercolor paintings look a bit too light, so you might want to pay attention to this first. Next, are the proportions correct? Because even if you have traced a photo, you can still mess up your painting with wonkiness and asymmetry. Lastly, did you paint nice shapes with your brush? Every layer we add will leave a lasting impact on the paper, so we want to make sure to paint as nice shapes as possible, because when the watercolor dries, it can't be changed anymore. At least not very easy. I use gouache paint for corrections, just so you know. Now, when you pay attention to these things, your painting will look better. Look at this example here. I didn't paint every shadow of the face, nor did I make it as smooth as the reference. Instead, I added a few clear layers of watercolor, created nice shapes, and even though they have harsh edges, the portrait turned out very lovely. Number 4. Use more abstractions. The medium watercolor is one of the best mediums for abstract effects. Besides the glass shards example I discussed in the beginning, you can add splatters, droplets, running down effects, metallic effects, bleeding paint effects, salt effects, and many more. It is literally the medium that does most of the work for you by itself. Experiment with all the different effects that this medium can do for you. It's a lifesaver, because a portrait for itself can look sometimes boring and dull, but adding a variety of abstract effects to it makes it so much more interesting without you having to think about it too much. Acrylic and oil painters have it so much harder in this regard because they have to actively paint these abstractions, whereas you, as a watercolor artist, can take advantage of the medium. For a more detailed explanation about how abstractions can improve your watercolor paintings, check out the last video I did. Number 5. Make a clean sketch. I think I can't stress this part enough, but it's so important to have a clean underdrawing. It will make your life so much easier. To make well-executed watercolor paintings, you have to be precise in certain areas. Of course, we also want to have loose and abstract areas, but if your underdrawing is a rough sketch, there's no way you can get proportions or details right. And with watercolors, you kinda only have a few attempts because, as I mentioned earlier, the first 2 to 3 layers have the most impact on the painting. When your underdrawing is not accurate, you might use the first layers to work out issues instead of focusing on color and shapes, and then you already have used up all your chances of beautiful first layers, and your paint will look muddy and dull. Here's an example. This is a study I did this weekend while watching children, and I didn't pay much attention to drawing a clean sketch, so I couldn't base my watercolor on a precise underdrawing. And this is what happened. Lots of wonky layers in the desperate attempt to get proportions and details right. And here is an example of a painting with precise and clean underdrawing. I could entirely focus on colors, values, and abstractions, and didn't have to think about proportions. My first layers turned out clean and pretty. And speaking of a clean sketch, do not draw your sketch directly onto your watercolor paper if you can avoid it, like I did in the previous example. Especially don't erase on it. This is the worst you can do to your watercolor paper. Watercolor paper is super sensitive and delicate, and the only thing we want to draw on it is the finished sketch and the drawing process we do when shading or adding details with color pencils. But we do not want to draw our first sketch on it. I personally work with digital mockups, by the way, and don't sketch that often, but many people do. So if you want to do it, draw your sketch on a different piece of paper and then transfer it onto your watercolor paper with charcoal tracing paper, for example. And that's it, guys. If you have some other essential tips you want to share with us, please post them in the comment section. And don't forget to give the video a thumbs up. See you on the next one.